In the heart of rural Louisiana, circa 1890, the Saturday market hummed with a life of its own, a vibrant tapestry of commerce and community under the oppressive humidity. The air was thick with the scent of fresh bread, damp earth, and something else, something richer, more alluring. This aroma emanated from the stall of Deacon Silas, a man whose reputation was as finely crafted as his famous smoked sausage. Families lined up, their faces beaming with anticipation, as Silas, a picture of pious serenity, served them his celebrated creation. He offered a warm smile to a mother and her children, but as they departed, his eyes, momentarily devoid of all warmth, drifted. They settled on a lone traveler, a man with weary shoulders and no local connections, who was aimlessly wandering past the edge of the crowd. In that fleeting, cold glance, a different kind of hunger was palpable, a chilling assessment that went entirely unnoticed by the cheerful patrons. The sound that defined this town square was not the church bell or the laughter of children, but the rhythmic, heavy thud of Deacon Silas's cleaver on his massive oak butcher block. It was a sound of reassurance, a promise of quality and tradition that echoed from dawn until dusk. His stall was a testament to meticulous order, gleaming hooks, neatly coiled links of sausage glowing with a deep mahogany hue from the hickory smoke, and a clean, sawdust-covered floor. The dominant smell, a complex and intoxicating blend of cayenne pepper, sage, and sweet smoke, clung to the air, drawing people in from streets away. It was a scent the townsfolk associated with comfort, with Sunday breakfasts and festive gatherings. They could not have known that this beloved aroma was a mask, a fragrant veil for a metallic tang of fresh blood that was not always from the livestock listed in his ledger. The town's favorite flavor was a carefully guarded, profane secret. Today, the site of that once thriving butcher shop is a place of profound silence and decay. The structure still stands, but it is a skeletal ruin, feared and avoided by the locals. Its roof has collapsed, allowing nature to reclaim the space with a slow, creeping vengeance. The walls, once immaculately whitewashed, are now covered in grime and creeping ivy, the wood warped and blackened as if from a fire that burned more than just timber. Tourists, drawn by morbid curiosity, are brought here by local guides who speak in hushed, reverent tones. They are told that if you stand here when the wind is just right, you can still catch a faint, cloying whiff of spice and smoke, a phantom scent that refuses to be exorcised from the town's memory. This is not just an abandoned building. It is a monument to a time when a community's faith was grotesquely betrayed, a scar on the landscape that tells a story of unimaginable horror, a solemn local guide, his face etched with the weight of the tale he is about to tell, gestures toward the rotting storefront. He explains to a small group of visitors that this was the domain of the man they now call the Godly Butcher. He speaks of how Deacon Silas's sausage was legendary, a recipe so coveted that people would travel from neighboring parishes just for a taste. Then, his voice drops, and he reveals the legend's hideous core. He tells them that the unparalleled flavor, the secret ingredient that made Silas's product so unique, was not some rare spice or a family technique passed down through generations. The unspeakable secret, he clarifies, was human flesh. The town, in its blissful ignorance, had not just been customers of a successful butcher, they had been unwitting accomplices in a sustained and monstrous act of cannibalism, savoring the very remains of the lost souls who had vanished within their borders. The victims were a procession of ghosts, individuals living on the frayed edges of society in an era before centralized records made a person's existence a matter of official fact. They were itinerant salesmen peddling cheap wares, drifters moving from one temporary job to the next, and desperate women fleeing lives of abuse and poverty. They were people whose absence would create no immediate void, whose disappearances would go unnoticed for weeks, months, or even forever. Deacon Silas was a meticulous predator, choosing his prey with the precision of a master craftsman. He understood that the world would not miss those it had already forgotten. The insondable question that hangs over this ruin is not simply what he did, but how he did it. How could a man so deeply embedded in the fabric of a devout community carry out such a nefarious enterprise, turning his neighbors into consumers of his grotesque sacraments? Deacon Silas was, by all public accounts, the embodiment of Christian virtue. A widower who bore his grief with quiet dignity, he was a pillar of his church. his donations always generous, his voice the most resolute during hymns. His hands, which were known for their skill with a blade and a grinder, were also the first to be offered in prayer or to help a neighbor in need. He was a man of routine, of discipline, of unwavering faith. This facade was his greatest weapon, an impenetrable armor of respectability that deflected all suspicion. The town saw a godly man dedicated to his craft and his community. They could not perceive the shadow that lurked behind the kind eyes, a predator driven by a twisted theology of his own making, who believed he was not a murderer, but a savior, offering a profane form of transubstantiation to the souls he deemed lost. The legend of the godly butcher is an echo that has endured for over a century, a chilling reminder that the most monstrous secrets can fester behind the most pious of masks. It is a story that has become woven into the very identity of this place, a piece of its history that is both shameful and terrifying. And since these dark stories travel through time and across distances, we invite you to mark your place in this chronicle. Tell us in the comments from which city you are joining us in this investigation and the exact time of your arrival. With your presence now recorded in our own ledger, let us turn back the clock to 1890 and discover how the first, almost imperceptible crack appeared in the impeccable facade of Deacon Silas. The arrival of Reverend Thomas in the parish of St. Martinville was seen as a sign of progress, a breath of fresh, educated air from the seminary in New Orleans. He was a young man, barely 30, with a thoughtful disposition and eyes that seemed to absorb every detail of his new surroundings. His first walk through the town square was an assault on the senses, a cacophony of commerce and conversation dominated by a single, pervasive aroma. It was a rich, savory scent of smoked meat and pungent spices that clung to the humid air, a fragrance that emanated directly from the stall of the town's most esteemed parishioner, Deacon Silas. The Reverend noted how the entire community seemed to orbit this one man and his celebrated product, a gravitational pull of both commerce and respect. He was, in every sense, the beating heart of this small, isolated world, and his influence was as thick as the hickory smoke that billowed from his chimney. His formal introduction to Deacon Silas took place after the first Sunday service. The butcher was a man carved from sturdy oak, with hands that seemed too large and powerful for his gentle demeanor. He offered the Reverend a firm, calloused hand and a smile that radiated paternal warmth. Silas spoke of his faith with a quiet, unwavering conviction, welcoming Thomas to his new flock and pledging his full support to the church's endeavors. Yet, as the deacon spoke, Reverend Thomas couldn't shake a subtle sense of unease. There was a peculiar intensity in the butcher's gaze, a flicker of something cold and appraising that seemed at odds with his pious words. It was a fleeting impression, easily dismissed as the nervousness of a newcomer, but it was a dissonance that the young preacher would not soon forget. The deacon's piety seemed less like a comfort and more like a perfectly constructed, impenetrable fortress. True to his word, Deacon Silas's support for the church was immediate and substantial. The following week, during the collection, he placed a heavy canvas sack onto the offering plate, its contents clinking with the solid sound of silver dollars. The donation was far more generous than any other, an act of charity that solidified his saintly reputation among the congregation. As Reverend Thomas formally recorded the contribution in the church ledger, he noted that this was a regular occurrence. The deacon's prosperity was directly and visibly channeled back into the house of God, a cycle of commerce and faith that left no room for question. The community saw it as proof of his divine favor, a man blessed for his righteousness. But for Thomas, the sheer weight of the money felt less like a blessing and more like a burden, an anchor of influence that held the town in a state of unquestioning reverence. It was during one of Deacon Silas's lay sermons that Reverend Thomas first encountered the man's disquieting theology. Speaking to a rapt congregation, Silas strayed from the day's prescribed scripture, instead focusing on a fervent, personal interpretation of redemption. He spoke of the world as being filled with lost souls, wanderers adrift without purpose or connection. He then spoke of the sanctity of the flesh, not as a vessel for the soul, but as a material substance that could be purified, consecrated, and given a new, higher purpose. He used the analogy of a butcher transforming a simple animal into sustenance for the community, elevating its worldly form. To the parishioners, It was a powerful, if eccentric, metaphor for God's work. To Reverend Thomas Dow, whose training was rooted in Orthodox doctrine, it sounded dangerously close to heresy, a twisted justification for an unnameable philosophy. The first crack in the town's placid surface appeared in the quiet confessional booth. A tearful woman named Isabel Perot knelt before the screen, her voice trembling as she spoke not of sin, but of worry. Her younger brother, a traveling salesman who peddled household tonics, was supposed to have passed through town nearly 3 weeks prior on his way to Alexandria. He never arrived. He was a man of routine, she insisted, who always sent a letter from each major stop. The letters had stopped. She had written to the town marshal, who had assured her that drifters often changed their plans without notice. But she knew her brother. Something was wrong. Reverend Thomas offered her prayers and solace. But as she departed, her story lingered in his mind, a solitary note of discord in the town's peaceful hymn. It was a story of a man who existed on the margins, a man whose absence was easily explained away. Within a month, 2 more such stories found their way to the Reverend's ear. An elderly man inquiring about a farmhand he had sent to the market for supplies, a man who had vanished along with the wagon and mule. Then, a letter arrived from a parish in Mississippi, a desperate plea from a mother seeking any news of her daughter, who had fled an abusive husband and was last known to be heading west through Louisiana. Each story was unique, yet they shared a common, haunting thread. The missing individual was a transient, a person with shallow roots, whose disappearance created no immediate or noticeable void in the fabric of society. To the town, these were unremarkable events, the predictable comings and goings of a transient population. To Reverend Thomas, it was becoming a pattern, a series of whispers that, when woven together, began to suggest a single, unspoken scream. His growing unease drove him to become a more vigilant observer of his flock, particularly its most prominent member. He began taking late-night walks, his path often leading him past the silent town square. It was on one such night that he saw it. Under the pale glow of a slivered moon, the back door of the butcher shop creaked open. Deacon Silas emerged, his powerful frame silhouetted against the dim light from within. He moved with a furtive haste that was entirely alien to his calm daytime persona, dragging 2 large but incredibly heavy burlap sacks from his workshop toward the tall, windowless smokehouse. The sacks were not shaped like animal carcasses. They were bulky and uneven, and they left a dark, wet trail on the dusty ground behind them. The deacon did not seem to be performing a routine chore. He seemed to be hiding evidence. Reverend Thomas concealed himself in the shadows of the adjacent livery stable, his heart pounding against his ribs. He watched as Silas struggled to haul the sacks into the smokehouse, the muscles in his back straining under the immense weight. The butcher cast nervous glances into the darkness, his head darting left and right, before disappearing inside and barring the thick wooden door from within. A few moments later, a faint light appeared through the cracks in the smokehouse walls, followed by the familiar, acrid scent of hickory smoke, an aroma that seemed profoundly sinister in the dead of night. The logical part of the Reverend's mind tried to find a rational explanation, a late delivery of hogs, perhaps. But his intuition screamed that what he had just witnessed was not commerce. It was the careful, methodical disposal of a terrible secret. From that night forward, the town's most beloved attributes began to feel menacing to the young preacher. The comforting, ever-present aroma of smoked sausage now seemed to carry a cloying, sickly sweet undertone that turned his stomach. He found himself analyzing it, trying to isolate a scent that he felt, rather than smelled, lurking beneath the heavy veil of sage and cayenne pepper. The rhythmic, reassuring thud of Deacon Silas's cleaver on the oak block during the day no longer sounded like the work of an honest artisan. Instead, it echoed in his mind as a percussive countdown, each heavy strike marking the end of something, or someone. The town's cherished traditions were becoming artifacts of a potential, unspeakable crime, and he was the only one who seemed to notice the change. His suspicion began to coalesce around a single, tangible point: the deacon's immense wealth and his ostentatious displays of charity. Where did all the money come from? While Silas was successful, his generosity seemed to exceed the plausible profits of a small-town butcher. The missing people, Thomas reasoned, were poor and transient, but they were not destitute. They would have carried what little they owned with them: cash from a recent sale, a few treasured possessions, perhaps a gold watch or a wedding band. The Reverend found himself drawn to the church's collection plates, polished silver vessels that held the town's weekly offerings. He recalled the heavy weight of the deacon's canvas sacks and wondered what secrets might lie within them, hidden among the coins. He resolved to inspect the next donation not as a man of God, but as an investigator. The following Saturday was dedicated to the quiet, meticulous work of maintaining the house of God. Reverend Thomas had taken it upon himself to polish the church's silverware, including the 2 heavy, ornate collection plates used during Sunday service. The task was methodical, a welcome respite from the troubling thoughts that had been plaguing his mind. The scent of beeswax and silver polish filled the small sacristy, a clean, wholesome aroma that spoke of reverence and tradition. He worked in silence, the gentle rasp of the cloth against the metal, a soothing, rhythmic sound. He picked up the plate that had held Deacon Silas's most recent and most substantial offering. Its weight felt disproportionate, a physical manifestation of the butcher's influence, and as he tilted it under the light, he felt a profound and inexplicable chill run down his spine. As he worked the polishing cloth into the deep crevices of the plate's embossed design, he heard a faint, incongruous rattle. It was not the familiar, flat slide of a forgotten coin. This was a sharper, harder sound, a small object skittering against the metal beneath the worn crimson velvet lining. Frowning, he shook the plate gently, but the object remained stubbornly lodged within. It was a minor annoyance, a trivial distraction, yet it held his attention with an odd intensity. He set down his cloth and turned the plate over, tapping it firmly against the palm of his hand. Nothing. The object was caught fast, a tiny secret held within the vessel of the town's charity. He felt a sudden, pressing need to retrieve it, an instinct he could not rationalize. Using the slender tip of a letter opener, Reverend Thomas carefully pried at the edge of the velvet lining where it met the silver rim. The old fabric, brittle with age, gave way with a soft tearing sound. He worked the tool underneath, gently lifting the material until he could peer into the shallow space below. There, nestled against the cool metal, was a small, dark object. He tilted the plate, and it slid out, falling onto the clean white polishing cloth with a muted clink. He stared at it for a moment, a small, circular piece of metal, caked with grime, and a faint, dark residue that might have been rust or dried blood. It was an unremarkable piece of detritus, the kind of thing that could have fallen from anyone's pocket during the chaotic passing of the collection plate. He picked up the object, rubbing the grime away with his thumb to get a better look. It was a brass button, no larger than a dime, with a small, intricate design stamped into its surface. An anchor. He was about to toss it into the wastebasket, dismissing it as a lost trifle from a parishioner's Sunday coat, when a memory, sharp and unwelcome, pierced through his thoughts. The image was vivid, the worried, tear-streaked face of Isabelle Perrault as she sat in his office. She had shown him a small, treasured daguerreotype of her missing brother, a handsome young man in a brand-new traveling coat. She had mentioned the coat specifically, noting with a sad smile how proud he had been of its distinctive brass buttons, each one bearing a tiny, embossed anchor, a detail so trivial yet so specific, it had been permanently etched into the Reverend's memory. The connection slammed into his consciousness with the force of a physical blow. The missing salesman, the coat with the anchor buttons, the collection plate, and the last person to have placed anything inside it, besides a handful of loose change, was Deacon Silas. The button could not have simply fallen in. It must have been scooped up along with the contents of the dead man's pockets. A single, overlooked piece of evidence mixed in with the heavy silver dollars that now rested in the church's coffers. The Reverend's breath caught in his throat. The room, once a sanctuary of peaceful contemplation, suddenly felt like a tomb. The air grew thick and heavy, and the wholesome scent of silver polish now seemed cloying and suffocating, unable to mask a phantom stench of decay. He sank into his chair, his hand trembling as he stared at the small piece of brass resting in his palm. It was no longer an object. It was a testament. It was an accusation. Every unsettling observation, every nagging doubt he had harbored about Deacon Silas, now began to coalesce around this single, irrefutable point of evidence. The late-night excursions to the smokehouse, the strange, heretical sermons on the purification of the flesh. The ever-growing list of travelers who had vanished without a trace, it was all connected. He had been looking at a series of isolated, troubling incidents, but this button was the thread that wove them together into a tapestry of unimaginable horror. The pattern was no longer a suspicion. It was a certainty taking shape in his mind. The true source of the deacon's staggering wealth was now sickeningly clear. His generosity, his role as the church's greatest benefactor, was not born of Christian charity. It was a form of laundering, a way to purify his ill-gotten gains by passing them through the hands of God. He was not just a butcher of livestock. He was a predator who hunted the weak and the transient, harvesting not only their bodies for his profane recipes but also their meager possessions. The silver dollars that had clinked so reassuringly in the collection plate were not the profits of an honest tradesman. They were the final assets of men and women who had ceased to exist, their value rendered down into cold, hard currency. The deacon's piety was the most elaborate and successful deception the Reverend had ever witnessed. A cold resolve began to settle over his initial shock. He understood the precariousness of his position. Deacon Silas was not merely a respected member of the community. He was its very foundation, a man whose reputation was as solid and unyielding as the oak block on which he worked. To accuse such a man based on the discovery of a single brass button would be seen as madness and, or worse, as a malicious attack on the town's most devout citizen. The town marshal, a man who valued peace and simplicity above all else, would dismiss his concerns out of hand. The community, so deeply invested in their belief in the deacon's goodness, would turn on him in an instant. He was alone in this knowledge, an unwelcome prophet in a land of blind believers. He carefully folded the polishing cloth around the button, the small, hard shape, a dense concentration of the horror he now faced. He could not simply present this discovery. He had to build a case. He needed more than a single piece of circumstantial evidence. He needed proof that was as undeniable and as gruesome as the crimes he suspected. The deacon's facade was nearly perfect, but there had to be other cracks, other inconsistencies that he had overlooked. His investigation could no longer be a passive exercise in observation. It now had to become an active and dangerous pursuit of the truth. He had to delve deeper into the deacon's world, into the very heart of his business, where he was certain the full, monstrous scope of his enterprise was hidden. With the button safely concealed in his pocket, its weight a constant, chilling reminder of his new purpose, Reverend Thomas left the sacristy. As he stepped out into the late afternoon sun, the familiar sounds and smells of the town square greeted him. He heard the distant, rhythmic thud of Silas's cleaver, a sound that now seemed to beat in time with his own racing heart. The faint, smoky aroma of the deacon's famous sausage drifted on the breeze, and for the first time, he thought he could detect something else within it, a sweet, cloying note that was deeply, fundamentally wrong. He was no longer just a preacher in a new parish. He was a witness, and he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to his soul, that he was now hunting a monster who wore the mask of a saint. Reverend Thomas knew that direct confrontation was impossible. It would be his word against a man whose reputation was the bedrock of the community. His only path forward was through the meticulous gathering of proof, a silent inquisition conducted in the shadows of the man he now suspected of monstrous deeds. He needed access to the butcher shop, a place he had previously avoided due to the unsettling aroma that now seemed to cling to his very soul. Under the guise of discussing the church's upcoming harvest festival and the deacon's traditional contribution of a prize-winning ham, Thomas planned his visit. He would feign an interest in the butcher's craft, hoping that Silas's pride would be a sufficient blindfold to his true, desperate purpose. It was a dangerous gambit, a pastoral call that was, in truth, an act of espionage against a figure he was beginning to believe was the devil incarnate. He found Deacon Silas behind the main counter, the rhythmic thud of his cleaver a percussive beat in the spice-laden air. The butcher greeted him with his customary warmth, wiping his large, blood-stained hands on a surprisingly clean apron before extending one in welcome. Thomas accepted the handshake, forcing himself to ignore the clammy, cold texture of the man's skin. He spoke of the festival, of the needs of the congregation, his voice steady despite the frantic pounding of his own heart. Silas was receptive, his pious demeanor as impenetrable as ever. He invited the Reverend into his back office to review the previous year's donation records. A small, cluttered room that smelled intensely of old paper, iron, and the sweet, cloying odor of hickory smoke that seemed to emanate from the very walls. This was the sanctum of the beast, and Thomas had just been willingly invited inside. The office was a study in contrasts. On one wall hung a simple, unadorned wooden cross. On the desk below it lay the tools of a brutal trade, sharpening stones, a leather strop, and a set of gleaming boning knives. As Silas turned to a large, dusty cabinet to retrieve the church donation receipts, Thomas's eyes scanned the room, desperately searching for anything that seemed out of place. His gaze fell upon a thick, leather-bound ledger resting on a small side table. Separate from the other account books, it looked like a standard business record, its cover worn smooth from frequent use. While Silas was preoccupied with the cabinet lock, Thomas moved toward it, his hand trembling slightly as he reached out. It was a simple ledger, something any business owner would keep. Yet its placement, its isolation from the other records, felt deliberate, almost secretive. With his back still turned, Silas continued to speak about the logistics of the festival, his voice a low, placid drone that did little to soothe the Reverend's frayed nerves. Thomas opened the ledger. The first several pages appeared entirely mundane, filled with neat, precise columns detailing transactions, dates, weights, and prices for hogs, cattle, and poultry. The handwriting was meticulous, the script of a disciplined and orderly mind. It was exactly what one would expect from a successful butcher. For a fleeting moment, Thomas felt a wave of relief, followed by the cold dread that he might be terribly wrong, that his suspicion was a paranoid fantasy born from a simple, misplaced button. He began to close the book, but an instinct, a divine or perhaps desperate curiosity, compelled him to leaf toward the very back, past the dated entries. It was there that the ordered world of commerce dissolved into something else entirely. The final dozen pages of the ledger were different. The neat columns were gone, replaced by dense, cryptic blocks of text. The entries were dated, but instead of listing livestock, they contained strange notations. Phrases like prime cut, 180 lb, fair condition, were followed by notes that made no sense in the context of animal butchery. Slight blemish on the left flank, or contents of pockets, $3 silver, a tarnished locket. Below these were even more disturbing anatomical diagrams, crudely but accurately drawn sketches of human musculature and bone structure, with specific sections circled and labeled with butcher's terms: loin, rib, shank. The dates beside these entries corresponded with chilling precision to the disappearances he had learned of. Reverend Thomas felt the blood drain from his face. He was holding a detailed, horrifying record of human slaughter. The code was brutally simple, a profane superimposition of his trade onto his victims. Each entry was a person, their weight and physical condition assessed like livestock at an auction. The entry dated 3 weeks prior, corresponding to the disappearance of Isabel Perrault's brother, was the most damning. It read, Special Order, 165 OLLBs, new coat. Beneath it, a small, meticulous note, itemized effects, 1 silver watch, billfold with $12, 1 brass button lost during processing. The last 4 words were a confession written in a madman's hand, a detail so specific and trivial that it could only be the truth. The ledger was not just a record of murder, it was a recipe book. He snapped the book shut, just as Silas turned from the cabinet, a sheaf of old receipts in his hand. The butcher's eyes narrowed for a fraction of a second, a flicker of cold assessment in their depths as he looked from the Reverend's pale, sweat-slicked face to the ledger on the table. Thomas forced a weak smile, commenting on the deacon's impressive record-keeping before making a hasty excuse about another appointment. He left the shop and walked back toward the church in a daze, the bustling sounds of the market fading into a dull roar in his ears. The world around him, once so familiar and reassuring, now seemed like a grotesque masquerade. The happy families buying their weekly supply of sausage were participants in an unspeakable sacrament, and the man they revered as a pillar of their community was the high priest of a cannibalistic cult. Over the next few days, the Reverend's knowledge became a suffocating burden. He secluded himself in the parish house, poring over his own records, matching the dates from Silas's ledger with the stories he had heard in the confessional and the letters of inquiry that had arrived from distant towns. The pattern was undeniable, a trail of missing persons that all led directly to the deacon's smokehouse. He ate little and slept less, haunted by the images conjured by the ledger's cold, clinical descriptions. The entire town seemed complicit in his mind, their cheerful ignorance a form of passive evil. He felt utterly alone, the sole guardian of a truth so monstrous that its revelation would not just shatter a man's reputation, but the very soul of the community he was supposed to lead. His changed demeanor did not go unnoticed. Deacon Silas, a predator keenly attuned to the slightest disturbance in his environment, sensed the shift in the young preacher. He observed the reverend's new, guarded posture during services, the way his eyes would no longer meet his own during the passing of the peace. The butcher understood that the secret he had guarded so meticulously for years was now, somehow, known. But rather than panic, he began to move with a chilling, strategic precision. His public displays of piety intensified. His donations to the church doubled. He spoke more frequently during services, his lay sermons becoming passionate, tearful affairs in which he lamented the creeping influence of doubt and skepticism in a world that so desperately needed faith. He was reinforcing his fortress, brick by sanctimonious brick. The deacon began to subtly poison the well of public opinion against the reverend. He would speak in hushed, concerned tones to other church elders about the young preacher's melancholy, his troubled spirit. He suggested that the pressures of his new posting might be too much for him, that his mind was perhaps unsettled by the move from the city. He never made a direct accusation, but he planted seeds of doubt with the skill of a master gardener, cultivating an atmosphere in which any future claims made by Thomas would be viewed through a lens of pity and suspicion. The community, eager to believe in the goodness of their benefactor, readily accepted this narrative. The reverend was becoming an outsider in his own church, isolated by the very man he sought to expose. The psychological warfare culminated in a private conversation after a sparsely attended Wednesday evening prayer meeting. Silas approached the reverend in the empty nave, the setting sun casting long, distorted shadows through the stained glass windows. He placed a heavy, paternal hand on Thomas's shoulder, his voice a low, conspiratorial whisper. He spoke of his concern for the reverend's soul, of the burdens a man of God must carry. Then, his tone shifted, the warmth evaporating to reveal something cold and hard beneath. He began to speak in parables, his eyes locked on Thomas's, their intensity a physical force. He spoke of the scripture that warns of wolves who come dressed in the clothes of sheep, of false prophets who seek to divide the flock for their own vain purposes. "A shepherd must be vigilant, Reverend," Silas murmured, his grip on Thomas's shoulder tightening almost imperceptibly. He must protect his flock not only from the dangers without, but from the sickness that can fester within. Sometimes, a shepherd may find a lamb that is weak or diseased, one that threatens the health of the entire group. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle in the cavernous silence of the church. In his wisdom, the shepherd knows that for the flock to survive, the diseased lamb must sometimes be culled. It is a terrible, but necessary, act of mercy, a purification. The threat was unmistakable, a death sentence delivered in the language of salvation. Silas was not just a murderer, he believed he was an instrument of divine will. Thomas stood frozen, the man's words echoing the heretical sermons he had heard before, now imbued with a terrifying, personal significance. The deacon's facade of piety had not cracked. It had instead become a weapon, turned directly against him. He was the diseased lamb, the wolf in sheep's clothing, the threat to the deacon's profane order that now needed to be culled. The butcher's confession was not in what he said, but in how he said it, a calm, righteous declaration of his intent to eliminate any obstacle to his sacred work. The conversation was over in a matter of moments, but it had irrevocably altered the landscape of their conflict. This was no longer just an investigation, it was a battle for survival. As Deacon Silas turned and walked away, his heavy footsteps echoing on the stone floor, Reverend Thomas was left trembling in the fading light. The butcher's warning had been a calculated risk, a demonstration of his absolute confidence and control. He believed himself untouchable, shielded by a reputation he had meticulously crafted over years of public charity and secret slaughter. The threat was meant to silence Thomas, to terrify him into abandoning his pursuit of the truth. But as the initial shock subsided, it was replaced by a cold, hard resolve. The deacon had made a fatal error. He had confirmed the Reverend's darkest suspicions and, in doing so, had removed any lingering doubt that might have tempered his actions. The time for discreet inquiry was over. The young preacher now understood that he could not fight this battle from the pulpit or within the confines of the church. The town was a lost cause, its faith held captive by the monster who fed it. His only recourse was the law, however skeptical or complacent it might be. He had to convince the town marshal, a man known for his aversion to any disruption of the peace, to act. He possessed the knowledge from the ledger, dates, names, and the horrifying details of the victim's final moments. He had the brass button, and now he had the memory of a direct, chilling threat from the killer himself. It was a fragile arsenal to bring against a giant, but it was all he had. That night, Reverend Thomas did not pray for his own safety, nor did he pray for the soul of Deacon Silas. He prayed for strength. He knew that the path ahead would lead to a place of profound darkness, a confrontation with an evil so profound it defied comprehension. He would have to force the town to look into the abyss, to see the true face of the man they so admired. He had to make them understand that the comforting aroma of spice and smoke that defined their home was, in fact, the stench of the grave. The investigation was over. The war was about to begin. He carefully wrote down every detail he could remember from the ledger, his hand racing across the page as if he feared the memories would evaporate. He created a timeline, a meticulous document that chronicled the disappearances and linked them to the deacon's cryptic entries. He drew a map of the butcher shop from memory, marking the location of the office and the ledger itself. He was no longer just a man of God. He was preparing a prosecutor's brief. He was building a case so detailed, so horrifyingly specific, that even the most reluctant of lawmen would be compelled to act upon it. He was preparing to unmask the godly butcher. His final act before dawn was to write a long, detailed letter to his bishop in New Orleans. He sealed it, along with the small brass button carefully wrapped in cloth, inside a heavy envelope addressed to his seminary mentor. He included explicit instructions that it was to be opened and delivered to the authorities if he was not heard from within 1 week. It was a morbid precaution, an acknowledgement that he was now facing a man who would not hesitate to make him the next entry in his profane ledger. With this grim insurance policy in place, he finally felt ready. He would go to the town marshal not as a paranoid preacher, but as the first and only witness to a reign of unimaginable terror. Town Marshal Antoine Dubois was a man who prized order above all else, a disposition that made him deeply resistant to the wild, almost blasphemous story Reverend Thomas laid before him. He listened with a stoic patience, his face a mask of weary skepticism, as the preacher presented his handwritten notes, his frantic timeline of disappearances, and the small brass button that served as the cornerstone of his incredible accusation. Dubois had known Deacon Silas his entire life. He was a rock, a pillar of the community. The marshal's first instinct was to dismiss the entire affair as a symptom of clerical exhaustion, a city preacher overwhelmed by the strange rhythms of country life. Yet there was a cold, desperate certainty in the Reverend's eyes that gave him pause. The detailed nature of the allegations, particularly the mention of a secret ledger, was too specific to be a mere fantasy. Reluctantly, he agreed that such a claim, however outlandish, had to be officially dispelled. Armed with a warrant procured from a similarly skeptical circuit judge, Marshal Dubois and Reverend Thomas arrived at the butcher shop just as the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long, ominous shadows across the town square. Deacon Silas met them at the door, his expression one of polite, pastoral concern. He expressed no surprise, no anger, only a quiet sadness that the Reverend's troubled mind had led to such a disruptive and public spectacle. He consented to the search with a magnanimous wave of his hand, inviting them to inspect his premises and put the young preacher's unfortunate delusions to rest. The main shop was immaculate, the floors scrubbed clean, the tools gleaming on their racks. An initial search of the main floor and the small office revealed nothing, absolutely nothing, out of the ordinary. The marshal shot Thomas a look of profound annoyance, his patience wearing dangerously thin. The search moved to the cellar, a dark, cool space that smelled of damp earth, cured meats, and the faint, ever-present aroma of hickory smoke. It was here, amidst barrels of salted pork and hanging links of sausage, that the Reverend's frantic energy returned. While the marshal inspected the contents of the barrels with growing exasperation, Thomas moved along the far stone wall, the one that separated the cellar from the foundation of the smokehouse. He ran his hands along the cold, rough-hewn stones, his knuckles rapping against the surface. Near the back, behind a stack of empty wooden crates, the sound changed. Instead of the solid, dense thud of stone and earth, there was a hollow, resonant echo. It was a subtle difference, one that could be easily missed, but to the preacher's heightened senses, it sounded as loud as a funeral drum. He called the marshal over, his voice a strained whisper. Together, they moved the heavy crates aside, revealing a section of the wall that was not stone, but expertly fitted wooden planks, stained and weathered to blend in perfectly with the surrounding foundation. There were no visible handles or hinges, but a thin, dark line revealed its seams. Using the pry bar he had brought, the marshal wedged the iron tip into the crack and leaned into it with his full weight. The wood groaned in protest before a section of the wall swung inward with a sickening screech, releasing a blast of cold, stagnant air from the darkness beyond. The smell that poured out of the opening was an abomination, a vile corruption of the familiar scent of the butcher shop. It was the cloying sweetness of old blood, the metallic tang of decay, and an underlying, indescribable foulness that made both men recoil, their stomachs churning in violent protest against the olfactory assault. Steeling themselves, they stepped through the opening, their lanterns cutting a trembling swath of light through the absolute blackness. They had entered a second hidden cellar, a secret chamber whose existence was a monstrous betrayal of the building's simple facade. This was not a space for storage or curing. It was a purpose-built slaughterhouse, a chamber of methodical human disassembly. Heavy iron hooks hung from the ceiling beams, positioned at a height meant for a human form. On a large, drain-sloped table in the center of the room, a collection of tools was laid out with surgical precision: saws, cleavers, and long, thin knives of a design neither man had ever seen before. The floor was made of dark, stained wood, the gaps between the boards black with what could only be years of accumulated blood and viscera. The air was thick and heavy, the silence profound and absolute. At the far end of the room stood the source of the town's most beloved flavor and its most hideous secret: a massive, industrial-grade meat grinder, its iron maw large enough to accommodate a human limb. It was bolted directly to the floor, its surface meticulously cleaned, but for a few dark, reddish-brown stains deep within the gears that no amount of scrubbing could ever fully remove. Beside it was a large basin, empty now, but its sides were coated with a greasy, discolored residue. The entire setup was a testament to a chilling efficiency, a process refined over years of practice. This was not the work of a man who killed in a fit of passion. This was the cold, calculated industry of a monster who had turned the act of murder into a craft, a production line for his profane culinary creations. This was the altar upon which Deacon Silas performed his unholy sacraments. The final and most nauseating discovery was in the corner of the room. Tucked away behind a stack of burlap sacks was a large, wooden barrel sealed with a heavy lid. When the marshal forced it open, the lantern light fell upon its contents, and Reverend Thomas let out a choked, involuntary cry. The barrel was filled to the brim with the personal effects of the dead, a layered tomb of stolen identities. There were spectacles, pocket watches, and worn leather wallets emptied of their cash. There were women's lockets, cheap tin rings, and a small, handmade wooden doll with yarn for hair. On the very top of the pile lay a stack of letters, tied with a faded blue ribbon, their ink blurred by dampness, their words of love and longing never having reached their destinations. This barrel was the true ledger, a silent, heartbreaking testament to the dozens of lives Silas had not just taken, but completely and utterly erased. When they ascended from that subterranean hell, they found Deacon Silas waiting for them in the main shop, calmly wiping down his countertop as if he were merely closing for the evening. There was no fear in his eyes, no panic in his movements. When the marshal, his face pale and his voice shaking with a rage he could barely control, placed him under arrest, the butcher simply nodded, a serene, almost beatific smile touching his lips. He did not resist. He did not deny. Instead, he offered a full and complete confession, his tone not of a criminal caught in the act, but of a theologian eager to explain a complex and misunderstood doctrine to a pair of unenlightened students. He seemed almost relieved that the time for secrecy had finally come to an end, that he could at last share the divine truth of his life's work. He described his method with a chilling, detached pride, explaining that he saw himself as a savior, not a murderer. The lost souls who wandered into his town, the drifters, the fallen women, the men without family or purpose, were, in his view, already dead in the eyes of God. He was merely completing a divine process. He would lure them to his shop with the promise of a hot meal and a safe place to rest, offering them a moment of kindness and Christian charity. This, he explained, was a crucial part of the ritual. He was offering them a final, fleeting taste of the grace they had forsaken in their aimless lives, a moment of peace before their transfiguration. He spoke of it not as a deception, but as a necessary prelude to their salvation, a final act of mercy before the holy work could begin. Once they were asleep, he would lead them down to his hidden abattoir, which he referred to as his chapel. There, he would perform what he called the purification. The killing was a ritual, he explained, a swift and precise act performed while he whispered prayers over their bodies. He believed he was not destroying a life, but rather consecrating the flesh, elevating it from its lowly, sinful state into something sacred. He saw the act of butchery as a form of transubstantiation, transforming the corruptible material of the lost into sustenance for the faithful. By feeding his victims to the community, he was giving their meaningless lives a final, glorious purpose, to become a part of the body of the flock, to be integrated into the very fabric of the righteous community that had, in his mind, unknowingly consumed and redeemed them. His confession was a masterpiece of diluted sincerity. He spoke of the spices he used not as flavorings, but as holy unguents, a blend carefully chosen to mask the taste of sin and sanctify the final product. He detailed how he would pray over the meat grinder as he worked, asking God to bless his creation and the flock who would receive it. There was no remorse in his voice, only the unwavering conviction of a man who believed he was an instrument of a divine, albeit brutal, plan. He saw the personal effects he collected not as trophies, but as relics, the last worldly remnants of souls he had successfully delivered from their purposeless existence. He was not a monster in his own eyes. He was a shepherd, culling the diseased from the flock and using their remains to nourish the strong. The marshal and the reverend listened in stunned, horrified silence. They had descended into the cellar expecting to find evidence of a simple, greedy murderer. Instead, they had unearthed a prophet of a dark and twisted faith, a man whose madness was so complete, so interwoven with the language of piety, that it was impossible to find the seam where the deacon ended and the devil began. The confession was more terrifying than the slaughterhouse itself, for it revealed that the source of the evil was not a simple absence of morality, but a grotesque and fully realized theology. The godly butcher was not just insane, he was a true believer, and his church was built on a foundation of bone, its sacraments seasoned with the flesh of the forgotten. The night air felt unnervously still as Marshal Dubois led Deacon Silas out of the shop in chains. The butcher walked with his head held high, his calm demeanor a stark, terrifying contrast to the heinous reality that now lay exposed in his cellar. He offered a serene nod to the small crowd that had begun to gather, drawn by the commotion. They stared back in confused silence, unable to reconcile the image of their pious benefactor in irons with the man they had known and trusted for decades. Reverend Thomas watched him go, the weight of his discovery settling upon him not as a victory, but as a profound and soul-crushing burden. He had sought the truth, and he had found it. But the truth was a cancer, and he knew with a sickening certainty that its revelation would not cleanse the town, but consume it. The confirmation of the horror was complete. The evidence was irrefutable, the confession absolute. But the real climax was not the arrest of a man, but the impending death of a community's innocence. Every meal they had ever celebrated, every Sunday breakfast, every festive gathering where the deacon's famous sausage had been the centerpiece, was now retroactively tainted, transformed into a scene from a nightmare. They had not just been deceived by a monster, they had been made into his unwitting acolytes, participants in a sustained act of cannibalism that had been the secret heart of their town for years. The physical evidence was locked away in the cellar, but the psychological horror was now loose, and it would spread through the streets like a plague, poisoning every memory and every relationship, leaving nothing but shame and revulsion in its wake. The news of Deacon Silas's confession did not spread through the town. It detonated. It was a truth so fundamentally vile that it defied immediate comprehension, leaving a wake of stunned silence before the screaming began. The initial reaction was not anger, but a violent, physical revulsion. Parishioners who had praised the deacon's sausage just days before now doubled over in the streets, their bodies convulsing in a desperate attempt to purge the unholy communion from their systems. Homes were filled with the sounds of frantic scrubbing as women scoured their kitchens with lye and boiling water, trying to eradicate the lingering, greasy residue of their own complicity. Every pleasant memory of a shared meal was instantly and irrevocably corrupted, transformed into a grotesque tableau of unwitting cannibalism. The town square, once the heart of the community, became a landscape of collective shame, its very air thick with the phantom taste of betrayal. Faith, once the town's bedrock, curdled into a furious, undifferentiated rage. That night, a mob formed, not with the cold deliberation of justice, but with the frantic energy of a body trying to expel a poison. They descended upon the butcher shop, their torches casting a hellish, dancing light on the familiar facade. This was not an act of law, it was an exorcism. They smashed the windows, splintered the door, and doused the interior with kerosene. The fire that erupted was voracious, consuming the butcher block, the counters, and the very walls that had hidden such profound evil. The blaze roared into the night sky, a pillar of communal fury, releasing a thick black smoke that carried a sickeningly familiar scent, the smell of burning wood, of rendered fat, and of spices, a final profane echo of the deacon's craft. They were not just burning a building, they were trying to incinerate a memory. Deacon Silas's trial was a formality, a brief and somber procedure to legitimize a foregone conclusion. He sat in the defendant's box, not with the posture of a penitent sinner, but with the serene confidence of a martyr. He listened to the testimonies, from Reverend Thomas, from Marshal Dubois, from the families of the few victims who could be identified, with a detached, almost clinical interest. When asked for his final words on the day of his hanging, he stood before the town that had once revered him and offered no apology. Instead, he delivered a final, chilling sermon. He spoke of their blindness, of their hollow faith, and promised them that while they may destroy his body, his work was now a part of them, forever. His last words, spoken with a calm, beatific smile, were a curse of remembrance, a promise that the flavor of his truth would linger on their tongues for generations. The fire did not cleanse the town, it merely cauterized the wound, leaving a hideous scar. The site of the butcher shop became a shunned and blackened ruin, a gaping maw in the center of the town square. Locals claimed that the ground itself was poisoned, that nothing would ever grow there again. The legend of the phantom scent was born in the weeks following the fire, as people swore that on humid nights, when the wind blew just right, they could still smell it, a cloying, sweet and spicy aroma of hickory smoke and something else, something indefinably foul, wafting from the scorched earth. The ruin was no longer just an empty lot. It became a monument to their collective sin, a physical manifestation of the corruption that had festered at the very heart of their community, a place where the ghosts of both the consumed and the consumers were said to linger. The social fabric of the town, woven from threads of shared faith and mutual trust, unraveled completely. The community turned inward on itself, poisoned by suspicion and shared guilt. Neighbors who had once broken bread together now eyed each other with a mixture of accusation and self-loathing. Who had enjoyed the sausage the most? Whose praise had been the loudest? The church, once the unifying center of their lives, became a hollow shell. Reverend Thomas, the man who had unearthed the terrible truth, was not hailed as a hero. He was a pariah, the living embodiment of a reality so monstrous that the town could not bear to look at him. Unable to lead a flock that saw him only as a harbinger of their own damnation, he quietly left the parish within the year, his own faith forever shaken by the depths of the evil he had exposed. A deep and permanent scar was carved into the town's culinary soul, The tradition of smoking and spicing sausage, once a source of immense local pride, died out completely. The very mention of it became a taboo, a word spoken only in hushed, cautionary tones. For generations, the aversion was passed down, a form of inherited trauma. Recipes were burned, smokehouses were torn down, and children were taught to distrust any food that was too rich, too savory, too alluring. The legacy of Deacon Silas was not just a story of murder, but the complete annihilation of a cherished cultural tradition, replaced by a deep-seated, instinctual fear. The taste of their greatest delight had become the taste of their most profound shame, a flavor forever linked to the unspeakable act of consuming the flesh of their fellow man. Over the decades, the gruesome facts of the case began to soften, blurring at the edges as history slowly calcified into legend. The specific names on the ledger, the exact number of victims, the methodical details of the trial, these things faded from living memory. What remained was the potent, terrifying core of the story. Deacon Silas, the man, became the godly butcher, a folkloric monster, a boogeyman used to frighten children into piety. His complex, heretical theology was simplified into a tale of pure, demonic evil. The story shed its historical weight and became a timeless parable, a chilling warning whispered from one generation to the next about the darkness that can lurk behind a mask of righteousness and the terrible price of blind faith. The truth was too complex and shameful to be remembered in its entirety. The legend was simple, terrifying, and eternal. Today, the town remains haunted by its past, a community that has never fully reconciled with the secret it was forced to consume. The blackened foundation of the butcher shop is still there, a place of pilgrimage for those with a taste for the macabre. Local guides, descendants of the families who once lined up for the deacon's product, now sell his story to tourists, their voices hushed with a mixture of practiced reverence and genuine, inherited fear. They point to the empty space and speak of the phantom aroma, of the oppressive silence that hangs over the lot, and of the restless spirits of the forgotten travelers whose only grave was the bodies of the townspeople themselves. The horror has been tamed, packaged into a digestible narrative, yet the unspoken truth remains. This is not just a tourist attraction, but a gravesite of unimaginable scale. The final unsettling question that the legend of the godly butcher leaves behind is not about the depths of one man's depravity, but about the nature of the soil in which such evil is allowed to grow. Was Deacon Silas a singular anomaly, a monster who descended upon an innocent community? Or was his evil a parasite that fed on the town's own willful blindness, on its desperate need for a righteous figurehead, and on its quiet, collective indifference to the fate of the strangers who passed through its gates? The horror of Silas is that he did not operate in the shadows. He operated in plain sight, shielded by a faith so absolute that it refused to see the monster it revered. He held a mirror up to the town, and the reflection it showed was of a flock that had willingly, cheerfully, devoured the lost lambs. The stories of the forgotten, like those of Silas's victims, often fade into the silence of history, their final moments lost to time. Our purpose here is to act as their archivists, to ensure that their echoes are never truly extinguished. The darkness of the past holds lessons that we must not allow ourselves to forget, for it is in these grim chronicles that we find the truest reflections of our own capacity for both belief and betrayal. To guarantee that these essential shadow-bound chapters of our history are never sealed away or left to decay, subscribe to our channel and help us preserve the permanent collection of the archives of the shadows.